Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar entitled 5 Keys to Upgrading Obsolete Manufacturing Test Systems, brought to you by Viewpoint Systems. I'm Jim Anderton, Director of Content here at engineering.com. I'll be your host for what promises to be just a fascinating hour. You know, aging test equipment, software upgrades, and higher levels of connectivity, well, they all drive the need to upgrade older test systems. Not surprisingly, companies, they often wait until the last minute to upgrade test equipment, and this causes unnecessary stress. In today's webinar, we'll learn when an improvised duct tape tester makes sense, how to effectively reverse engineer for a smooth transition, how to minimize production downtime lost during a changeover, and tips for planning and comparing a new test system against the existing test equipment. Now, just a reminder to attendees, on the console in front of you, there is a panel that allows you to pose questions. And go ahead and type questions in, and I will moderate those questions and then present them to our speakers at the end of today's presentation. Now, about today's speakers. Dr. Jim Campbell began his career in test and measurement by developing signal processing and numerical analysis functions for Assist, which once was a competitor to LabVIEW. He co-founded Viewpoint Systems in 1993 to provide custom test systems to manufacturers and is now company president. Viewpoint designs and builds test systems for new designs to upgrading obsolete systems. Jim has a BS in physics from Bucknell University and a Master's of Science in Electrical Engineering and a PhD from the University of Rochester. Our second guest speaker is Sam Sanzone. Sam began his career performing research and development reliability testing of specialized aircraft antenna systems for various DoD contractors, and he spent several years developing complex test systems in areas of advanced R&D and also manufacturing for military, commercial, and the satellite industries. He's currently a project manager and lead engineer at GE Energy Connections. Sam has worked at GE since 2005, managing and leading multiple field services engineering projects, and has a BS in electrical engineering technology from the Rochester Institute of Technology. And we'll kick off with Jim. Jim?
Okay, thanks. And thanks for attending this presentation. This is Jim Campbell speaking. So we plan on reviewing some key considerations for those who are interested in upgrading an obsolete test system. And typically we find that test systems go obsolete in about 10 to 25 years of use. And obsolescence can be due to software or hardware or both. And besides the intro that Jim just gave, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Viewpoint Systems and how we got involved with SAM. So as Jim mentioned, Viewpoint Systems designs and builds test systems. And over the years, we've had many clients who have asked us to upgrade their obsolete test systems. So hopefully we have a lot of experience to share with you today. And for those who are familiar with National Instruments, we are platinum level system integrator of National Instruments, and we're one of 4 headquartered in the United States. And we work hard to be one of the best. And as Jim mentioned, our other presenter is Sam Sanzone. And Sam and Viewpoint met about 8 years ago when we were involved in an upgrade of a very obsolete test system used to test one of GE's products. The test system was one of a kind and critical to production. So Sam and Viewpoint had direct and personal knowledge of the stresses involved with replacing critical test equipment. And we will both cover ways to increase your success and share some lessons learned. So let's talk about some good reasons for upgrading test systems. And if any of you have been involved in upgrading test systems before, I'm sure some of these sound familiar, so look for those. So the first thing is that pushes most companies to upgrade is hardware. Hardware tends to be old, maybe it's irreplaceable, or perhaps it's inadequate for testing the next generation product. And sometimes it's just plain broken. Old hardware components could be computer equipment, measurement devices, standalone controllers, sensors, or actuators. And failures could be electronic or mechanical. Another big reason that companies upgrade is their operating system. It's out of date and no longer supported. Often IT wants to upgrade the OS for security and support reasons. And sometimes upgrading obsolete hardware, like we just mentioned, forces an upgrade to the OS because drivers that are required to communicate with the devices are no longer available with the old operating system. In my experience, those two issues, old hardware and obsolete operating system, account for probably 70 to 80% of the upgrades that we do. And the reasons that people tend to use these two hardware and operating system issues, it tends to be very reactive in that the company usually doesn't perform the upgrade unless they absolutely have to. But let me tell you about some reasons that people proactively upgrade. One of the most common is to make modifications to the software in the old test application in order to add functionality. But often the development tools for these old applications are lost. So you have to upgrade the development tools, and often that starts a cascade of other reasons to upgrade, such as new hardware drivers. Another proactive reason to upgrade is better access to test data. It used to be decades ago that test systems would be standalone and not share their test results with any other system. Nowadays, people want to be able to take the test data to help improve product designs or maybe manufacturing processes by analyzing the test data. And the last item I'll mention is that manufacturers may want to speed up the tester because the old tester is too slow and they'd like to put in some faster capability, which usually happens by installing a new PC, some new measurement hardware, new software, or some combination of all these things. So I've given you a quick overview of the reasons to upgrade, and we would like to ask a poll question here just to understand a little bit where you guys are in terms of your obsolete test systems.
Thanks, Jim. And here's our first quick poll question. Go ahead and respond on your console. If you have an obsolete test system, what's the most pressing reason for you to upgrade? Please select one. Is it an old operating system? Do you have old or failing hardware components? Do you have manufacturing improvements that are necessary? Do you have old software development environment? Or are there other reasons? So if you have an obsolete test system, what are the most pressing reasons for you to upgrade? And as the responses come in, we'll stand by here for a few seconds and we'll monitor responses, and we'll have poll answers in a matter of a few seconds. Go ahead and make your choice on the console in front of you. Results are coming in now. We can see them come in. They will be on the board in a matter of seconds. And here are the results. Old or failing hardware components are by far and away at 42% the most popular response. Manufacturing improvements at number 2, followed by an old operating systems. Interestingly, an old software development environment is relatively low ranked at 8% of respondents. So it's answers that may. Jim, do these results correspond with your experience?
Yeah, so I'm just summing up the first two, which are the old operating system and the old hardware components, which typically is, I said, 70 to 80%, and that was summing up to just about 60. So it's a little less than I've seen in the past, but certainly within line. But it certainly does point out that probably indicating that most people that upgrade their test systems are doing so when they absolutely have to in a reactive mode. And what we're going to talk about today is ways to be able to not be so reactive and be more proactive. So let's move to the next slide here and talk about easing the stress of doing your upgrades. I guess the one big thing I want to mention about easing stress is do whatever you can to not wait until the tester breaks. Let's talk about some ways that we can make that happen. Okay, when we get around to doing test system upgrades, oftentimes people will essentially have two basic routes to go. And one of those routes is to patch the test system, and the other route is to replace the entire test system. Our experience shows that most companies start by patching using a little quote-unquote duct tape. Basically what that means is they will try and use some pieces and parts to patch their test system to keep it operational for a while longer. There's absolutely nothing wrong with patching, Duct tape is a wonderful thing. If you're an engineer, I know you'll appreciate that. But it does require some thought and planning. Our experience shows that if a company had used duct tape once, they'll probably use it again. Again, that's fine with some thought and planning. And it's worth keeping some of the old components of the tester. Eventually, you're going to end up going down a path where so much has been replaced that you're going to start considering a complete upgrade. How do you decide which path is best? What we've discovered over time is that the best thing to do is review the life cycle of the tester components to see if a duct tape solution is viable and reasonable. This review will help you prioritize your upgrade needs. Likely you're going to find some parts of the test system that you should be given a priority to the upgrade versus other parts that can be delayed or reduced in scope. So for example, maybe you have an IT department that wants to upgrade your operating system. So you take that opportunity to go look at all the components that are in your tester, and you scan through all the hardware, and you find out that all that hardware is going to be available for a long while yet. There's no end of life in sight. And better yet, drivers for all this hardware is still available for the new operating system. So perhaps with some minor patching of the test application software, you'll be able to keep the entire rest of your hardware and not have to upgrade the entire system. Or on the hardware side, the number of spares you have at hand might affect your decision. Maybe you have enough spares in hand to run through an obsolete component for many more years to come. Or perhaps you can make a last-time buy of some component that's going to end of life. Either way, this gives you a way to be able to manage which components need to be upgraded and which ones don't, to allow you to patch it or duct tape it to keep the system going. One thing I'll mention is to pay attention to interactions between the tester components. For example, upgrading an old obsolete analog card might be great until you upgrade the operating system, because as soon as you do that, you have to upgrade the PC because the drivers aren't available anymore. So there might be a cascade that you have to watch for. And also, you should match the life cycle of the tester with the life cycle of the products being tested. For example, there's no point in upgrading the tester if the only product that you're testing is going to not be manufactured next month. Point is that thought and planning to consider how long you need to be able to keep each component last in order to prioritize your upgrade path. So often, a little duct tape makes great sense. Let's talk about one of the most critical pieces of doing an upgrade, and that's reverse engineering. If you're extremely fortunate, the builders of the existing test system will have left comprehensive, up-to-date documentation, complete with things like system design, bill of materials, wiring schematics, and maybe even an acceptance test procedure with results. Oh yeah, and all that documentation is correct too. Even if it's got red lines and markups, people who built the existing test system documented all of it. Well, I'll just tell you that's a dream. I've never seen such a situation, or at least it's rare at best. So the system usually needs to be reverse engineered. And especially important in any reverse engineering process is attention to detail. Anyone involved in this activity needs to be especially thorough and well organized, i.e. anally retentive, because a seemingly inconsequential item can result in unexpected behavior in the new system. Let's talk through some of the important parts of a test system that need to be considered for a successful reverse engineering. And oh, by the way, for the audience, just to check to see how detail-oriented you are, did you notice there's two detail-orienteds? Just a little engineering joke there. Okay, so some pieces to consider during an upgrade. The first is understand your signal path. You want to understand everything that happens to the signals that are being measured, starting at the sensor and ending with the A to D values. You want to consider items such as sensor models, signal level and bandwidth, connection interfaces to the UUT, the unit under test, wire types, are they shielded or twisted pair, signal conditioning, and so on. Also, what are the operating conditions of the tester? What's the temperature range that it might be used in? Or how are the sensors going to be used? Are they subject to heavy vibration? Are they spattered with hot oil? You have to understand all these pieces so that you can understand what to choose for the new tester. Obviously, you're going to need to understand how the signals are processed and what sort of analysis is being done on those measured signals. Of course, you need to know how those data are being processed in order to be able to convert it into test results. And specifically, you need to understand the pass-fail algorithms in order to understand how the UUT is assessed. So for each test step, you have to go and understand what the procedure is that's used to decide whether UUT passes or fails. And here's one that's often overlooked, and this is the operator user interface. Ask yourself, should the original UI be kept around, or should you change it to enhance the user experience? A benefit of keeping the UI the same is you don't have to retrain operators, but maybe it's clumsy to use and you want to upgrade it to make it easier for operators. Another thing that's often overlooked is configuration and test data formats. You need to review every type of file that's ingested or produced by the existing test system. For example, configuration files might give you insight into the use of the equipment and the data processing and analysis algorithms. Configuration files might contain test step setup, equipment setup, or test sequence definitions. And if you currently have a lot of configuration files, such as test sequences, you might want to consider whether to convert those over to the new test system or make the new test system reuse those. You should also consider whether any data files that are produced need to be compatible with downstream analyses or storage. And finally, prepare for differences. This topic is big enough that I'll specifically cover it later in the presentation, but the whole point is all the new test systems will probably give different results slightly, and you want to understand how that can happen and be able to respond to it. But in all, with reverse engineering, the biggest thing is remember that detail is very important, and don't assume anything. Ask questions. So next, let's talk about impacts to production. In this scenario, you have to worry about the fact that you're going to be replacing the old system with a new test system, and you're going to want to consider what the impact is going to be to production. It'd be great if the old test system could be just removed quickly, the new test system put in place after connecting up some wires, you do a quick check of verification of the operation, and you're done in less than an hour. Oh, and by the way, the manufacturing supervisor doesn't even care because you did it over a shutdown. But in reality, production will be impacted. Our experience is that the cutover typically takes at least a day, and maybe even as much as a few weeks. And of course, during this time, manufacturing will be breathing down your neck. So it's really important to understand the impact of production and ways to minimize that. In easy situations, the existing test system can quickly be put back into production if the new tester has issues. In other words, you can take out the old tester, quickly connect in the new one, make sure it works or not, do some debugging, pull out the new tester and put the old one back in so that you minimize impacts to production. In difficult situations, the old tester is an integral part of the production line. Removing it is laborious, and it's practically impossible to return to it. And that's a scenario that Sam's going to talk to with that project that we did at GE. At any rate, the best part is to remember that in order to reduce production impacts, you should do as much debugging as possible ahead of time. So let's talk about that. For a simple swap out, this is a scenario where you could possibly take the old tester out and quickly put the new tester in. Some things you'll want to do before you even start to put that new tester in is debug for the purpose of checking to see whether you can connect to the production network. You'll identify any IT connection and security issues this way. Next, connect any production databases or folders for that same reason. You want to be able to make sure you can read and write data. And finally, this is probably most importantly, run some parts. Do some at least partial testing, even if by hand, because you'd like to catch any hiccups in using the tester. Of course, some test steps might not be feasible without the rest of the test system ecosystem, such as that environmental chamber, which production is always using. But just do your best. The whole point is to make sure you can test as much as possible. Now, when you want to be able to, or want to have to tear out the old system, there are some things that you should do in addition to those first three that I mentioned. First, create a simulation system that includes detailed simulations for all interactions with the product, the fixturing equipment, the signals, and the production line. Time and cost of this effort can be substantial, but it's going to be invaluable to debug how the new tester will operate when it gets put into the actual production line. And relative to simulations, I'll mention a trick that really helps is to be able to digitize the actual signals that the existing tester is using and seeing right now. Because then you can take those signals and play them back into the new system to simulate what the UUT and production line sensors and so on will present to the new test system. Another thing that's very important that we found is operator feedback on the user interface. You want to make sure that the operators are going to be happy with whatever you produce in that new tester before they have to actually start using it. And the third item there, item number 6, is to push data into the ERP, MES, and reports for making sure that downstream analyses and report generation work properly. Now, in addition to these test debugs, some other items that apply to both are listed below. The first thing is you might want to talk to the production people to plan to build up some inventory. Take your estimate for the time it will take you to bring up the new tester and double it, or maybe even triple it, because things never go as you plan. You want to mention that downtime to the production people so they can consider building up an inventory to buffer any unexpected production outages. And another thing that we've stumbled on is if your new test system needs to undergo a recertification that involves a sign-off by the end customer, we often see that for military and aerospace component manufacturers, be sure to engage them prior to placing the new tester into production. This engagement is important because recertification can be a significant portion of the overall upgrade effort, sometimes as much as 50% in our experience. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the need to be able to look for differences in the old and new test system. So let's talk about how some of those differences appear. Specifically, let's talk hardware first, and then we'll talk about software. I'll describe some examples of actual upgrade projects that we did to describe some of the scenarios. In the first example, we had a customer who had a very old manual tester where the operator was writing down readings on panel meters. So they were taking the panel meters, looking at the values, and writing them down on a pad of paper. These panel meters had analog low-pass filters built in. Of course, those filters were used to stabilize the visual display. But the new system, which used high-speed analog digitizers, was much more responsive. The manufacturer was stunned at how the reading was bouncing around in the new tester. Of course, that was due to noise in the signal, but they never saw it because of the low-pass filters in the meters. So we ended up implementing a digital low-pass filter to average the results of the noise, and they were much happier. Another client had consistently mismatched readings between what the new system was measuring and the old system was measuring. Turned out that the calibration on the old system was out of date. Something as simple as that can cause head scratching as to why there are differences in the readings. Another customer had an obsolete spectrum analyzer. We replaced that with a Delta Sigma analog input card and computed the power spectrum in software. But the power spectral measurements were different between the old and new testers. So we just connected a signal generator to both testers at the same time. And we showed that the old system scaled the data as power spectral density, whereas we were scaling it as just raw power spectrum. So we changed the new system to match the old. And the last one, which was another head scratcher, was the battery manufacturer. These people wanted to measure the AC impedance of a battery by driving a small AC ripple on top of the battery DC voltage. We found that the impedance measurements were consistently different between the old and new testers. Turned out that the old system drove a different current level into the UUT and also had an analog input impedance about 1,000 times less than the new system. And apparently the battery had some nonlinear behavior which caused the differences in the testers. A significant amount of time was spent understanding the differences between the old and new before agreeing that the new test system was doing its job properly, albeit differently. So these examples illustrate the importance of understanding the new test system from a hardware perspective, and the fact that there are many ways that they can act differently. So let's talk about software. Specifically, when you're upgrading a system and you're needing to change the software, a lot of your decisions come down to two parts. One, do you have software or don't you? Let's talk about when the source code is available. Even with that point, you may stumble right out of the gate. What do you do if the application was developed in an environment that is unavailable now, like some old VB6 application? You may have to go through some hoops to be able to even use that source code. But eventually you'll get the source code in good shape and open it up in a modern development environment. And when that happens, you should develop some white box testing around the old and new code to make sure that old and new software matches. The hardest situation is when the source code is not available. What do you do now? In our experience, the best you can do is to reconstruct the software that automates the test steps. Search for all the documentation. Excuse me, I forgot to advance slides here. Search for all the documentation that you have by working with manufacturing engineer and test operator to observe the old tester operation step by step to develop a new set of test requirements. And as a word of caution, even if there is documentation available, we recommend that you do the same thing just to validate that any documented information is up to date, and if not, update it as needed. In either case, you'll want to run some additional tests on the old system so to make sure that you really understand its operation. And that time will take away from production, because remember, you're doing this on the old test system. This situation is not ideal, and you can almost guarantee differences between the old and new tester. But with careful review and detailed reverse engineering, differences can be reduced or maybe even eliminated. How do you know whether the old and new testers are actually the same? There are three methods that you can do to do this. First one is make sure that the old and new, or before you do any of this, make sure that the old and new systems are calibrated. So in this first method, verify that the old and new systems obtain the same readings within some acceptable tolerance. This method neglects any data analysis algorithms that might be embedded in each test step, but for simple test steps which use raw measurement limit checks, this method is good enough, and it doesn't require any UUTs. A more complicated method, which is better, is to use a set of gold units and perform complete tests on them with both testers and look for pass-fail differences. So you're going to want to include some units in that gold unit set that have known failures to validate that both testers generate the same pass-fail results. Note that this level of verification focuses only on the final determination of the pass-fail disposition and not the underlying readings that result in the pass-fail. But for many testers, that's all you really care about. Knowing the final results match is good enough. Finally, the most comprehensive method is to apply a gauge R&R to that same set of gold units on both testers. This level of validation is based on statistical analysis of the actual test data used in the pass-fail checks. Test system variations are separated from operator and part variations, so statistical significance of any difference in the mean values between the old and new testers can be assessed. And then the last tip that I'll mention is a tech refresh plan. What is a tech refresh plan? Essentially, it's a series of questions that guide you to understand two main topics. First, you want to understand the life cycle of both the tester components and the products being tested. And second, you want to review possible upgrade options. If you've already have a test systems that are older than 3 to 4 years, you should do your review now, especially if the people involved with the original build are either about to retire or otherwise leave their position. You don't want to lose their knowledge. Then establish a cadence of about 4 years to review the test equipment using a tech refresh plan as a guide. What if you've already recently upgraded a test system? Then you should use the tech refresh plan at roughly that same 4-year interval, starting the countdown clock now. What's a tech refresh plan have? There are 5 main areas that are covered in a tech refresh plan, as listed in this slide here. We're going to point you to a tech refresh plan checklist that we'll send you in a follow-up email, and we'll fill in some of the details behind these topics. But as a quick review, a tech refresh plan takes all the people that are concerned about the longevity of the test system and gets them to walk through a series of questions about why they would consider upgrading the test system, what might need to be upgraded, what components might make the most sense to upgrade, and how might you accomplish that upgrade, and how are you going to pay for it, and when. Like I said, a tech refresh plan should be done on a periodic basis so that you can react calmly to any part becoming obsolete. We recommend a cadence of 4 years, starting now if you've never done one. So again, we'll watch for an email from us. We'll send one out to you with more information about a tech refresh plan. It's just too much detail to go through right now. So I have a couple more poll questions to ask. And the first one is presented right now.
All right, thanks, Jim. And here's our next quick poll. Go ahead and answer on the console in front of you. And the question is, do you plan to start upgrading a test system within the next 1 to 4 months, 5 to 12 months, 1 to 2 years, greater than 2 years, or are you not planning currently to upgrade your test system? Go ahead and choose one of those responses on the console in front of you, and we will calculate those test results in real time and present them in just a few seconds. So the question is, when do you plan to start upgrading a test system? 1 to 4 months, 5 to 12 months, 1 to 2 years, greater than 2 years, or are you not planning to upgrade a test system? And results are coming in as we speak. And of course, we will have the results on the screen, and here they are. Interesting. Now we have a much broader spread of test results here. In this case, not planning to upgrade the test system, currently the leader at 37%, but there's a very flat distribution of other responses between 1 to 4 months and greater than 2 years. What do you think of these results, Jim?
Yeah, so honestly, that's a little bit different than I would have expected, mainly because I would have thought people interested in this presentation would have had something that was a little more eminent. All I can say to the majority that are out there is that look for our tech refresh plan document and checklist that we'll send you. It may be a great opportunity for you to go through and make sure that you're not in imminent danger of having a test system go out obsolete in a few years. Okay, so I have another question after that, and that's
here it is, our third poll question. Our quick poll is, what's your biggest barrier to moving forward with an upgrade? And please select one of the following. Is the biggest barrier not having a good time to take your line down? Is it creating a plan to upgrade? Is it getting the project budgeted? Is it that your leadership doesn't think that this is important, or are there other reasons? The question is, what is the biggest barrier you perceive to moving forward with an upgrade? And results are coming in now, and results we'll be able to tabulate and present in a matter of seconds. All of those, at one time or another, I think we've encountered in the industry. And results are coming up, infilling nicely in a matter of seconds. This will be ready, and Here they are. Now, in this case, interestingly, leadership doesn't think it's important by far and away, the leader, followed by getting the project budgeted. So it's about leadership intent and money primarily, and line stoppages, and the planning issue, and a distant third and fourth. And Jim, is this as you expected?
Yeah, so this is exactly like I was hoping based on the prior question. You're right. Our experience is that leadership tends to drag their feet quite a lot on wanting to upgrade test systems partially because of the cost involved, and partially because of the perceived non-importance, meaning that they think the test system is going to be lasting for a while longer. And all I would say to this again is that, and especially with regard to the project budget, the tech refresh plan is great for being able to pull together some data and present to management as to whether it does or doesn't make sense to upgrade a test system. So that's great results. Okay, so at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to talk about the one project we worked on, a very, very difficult project, a lot of obsolete components.
Thank you, Jim. Good day, everyone. As Jim stated, my name is Sam Sanzone. I am a project manager and lead engineer in the field services segment with GE Energy Connections Industrial Solutions. Today I'm going to present some of the real-life aspects which were encountered and should be considered when upgrading a test system, and our approach on upgrading the automated capacitor test system, or ACS, as it's known as. The ACS is a one-of-a-kind test system which tests power capacitors in a manufacturing production environment. Its uniqueness is that the system can perform multiple tests simultaneously, thus greatly improving production throughput. Okay, so the ACS was designed in the mid-70s. The control system was designed using integrated circuits and op-amps, which at that time were considered cutting-edge technology. The computer system was a 286-based industrial PC with somewhere around 8 meg of memory. Now, keep in mind, this was a lot back then. The system functioned well for many years. Over time, however, component and board level failures steadily increased, resulting in increased system downtime. Troubleshooting and maintenance repair could take hours and sometimes days due to obsolete components, which in turn resulted in a loss of production. In the later years, upgrades were planned to improve performance and extend test capabilities, but would be very difficult to complete on the old platform. There was a clear need for a new technology platform, not only to resolve the downtime and maintenance issues, but also to enable building on the platform the desired improvements. For this project, we were provided critical to quality items, or CTQs, which were considered important to the success of the upgrade project. Since only the controls system and software were being upgraded and the high voltage equipment was staying in place, the following CTQs were mandated. First, the system operation had to be functionally equivalent. The tests performed were standard requirements, so basically we needed to duplicate those tests. Next, minimal operator retraining was paramount. The look and feel of the operator HMI needed to be very similar to the existing operator interface, both functionally with hard and soft push buttons and visually with the various screen displays. The real estate would not change, so the operator station had to fit in the same location as present, as well as the several I/O control panels. Most importantly, the retrofit downtime had to be minimal. Downtime directly impacts production output which in turn negatively impacts schedule, customer deadlines, sales, and so on. From a technical perspective, when you begin a system upgrade project, usually the project manager or engineer starts with gathering of the existing documentation. The foremost document here would be the technical specification. The technical specification should provide a functional description, desired CTQs or outcomes, general design requirements, software specification, I/O points, and so on. Other documentation includes drawings, schematics, software documents, etc. It is always better to have a documented specification, especially if the project is large or for an outside customer. If the customer does not have a written specification, then it's usually a good idea to create one yourself and have the customer review and approve it. In most cases, as Jim mentioned, the documentation is not maintained with the hardware and software changes, which can occur over time. This is where reverse engineering plays an important role. This was the case with the axe. Furthermore, the software source code was not available. So while we could gather information on the hardware, the I/O functionality and software decision-making was unknown. This is where viewpoint systems played an important role. For a time period prior to the shutdown, we were allowed to connect data loggers to the system to monitor operation during production acceptance testing. Multiple I/O points were monitored during normal operation to gather data on how the system responded to the multitude of conditions during most test activity. So we monitored the various stimuli, responses, and I/O execution in both pass and fail condition. All this upfront work enabled us to piece together the puzzle of how the system really operated and provide a great baseline as to how we wanted the new system to behave. There are different ways to minimize the impacts of production. Again, if the project is within your company, you can speak directly with a production manager or manufacturing engineer. This is more important with an outside customer. Regardless, whether in-house or a customer point of contact, the person you deal with should have detailed knowledge of how the system works. This makes it much easier to understand and develop the best approach in coordinating the various stages of the outage with the new system installation. It can also minimize and improve the decision-making process when unexpected issues or problems arise. Let's talk about planning. In almost everything we do, a good plan usually yields good results. My point of contact and I went through numerous scenarios of how we were going to disassemble the old controls system and install the new control systems. Why? Because once the teardown started, there was no turning back. So things like equipment staging, manpower, and scheduling played an important role in the planning activity. Our mandate was to minimize the production downtime, so we did not have the luxury of taking our time after installation to troubleshoot and fix problems. Once the control systems were connected to the high voltage equipment, it had to work as quickly as possible. Since high voltage equipment was not available for checkout, we decided to design a simulator which would act as the high voltage equipment section. Viewpoint Systems was again instrumental in developing the simulation system to properly respond to the controls stimuli. And you can see in the lower right there, the bundle of wires and how we connected the simulation system to it. These were the actual I/O control systems were on the outside of that. This process greatly increased our confidence that the system would work as planned and helped to minimize the startup and commissioning phase. Another major benefit for the simulator was operator training and feedback. We literally set up, as we mentioned, the large bench area with the control panels around the perimeter and the simulation equipment on the bench. We scheduled the operators, these are the actual production operators, to sit down in front of the new computer, and you see that photo on the left represents what the operators now see. And the benefit was twofold. First, this gave the operators hands-on training and an increased comfort level. So when the system was installed, they would be able to start right in with operational testing. Secondly, and equally important, we were able to get feedback from the operators on what was right and what needed to be changed. So we were able to make the changes and improvements before the outage even started. To summarize, a simulation system may be additional upfront cost, but it can really reduce the impact of troubleshooting and training, and thus helps to minimize the impact of downtime. In the end, production can resume more quickly and therefore reduce downtime costs. One of the areas in the system design that I had a hard time realizing was that the new system would have differences from the old system. The fact is, with old technology versus new technology, you cannot. There was roughly a 30-year hardware technology span, which is huge, coupled with the fact that we didn't have the source code to duplicate the processes. We had to make our best guess at how the code worked. What we did do was to develop a software design document to present to the customer how the new system was going to work and collaborate with the customer in gaining acceptance. Another area of documentation was the operator test screens. These various displays were available based on test outcomes and were photographed and assembled into a binder. So duplication of the original screens to the HMI was possible. It must be mentioned, however, that the new displays were very similar but not exact. Because of the new technology, we were able to add graphical improvements not possible with the old technology. Bottom line, it is essential to have customer involvement and, if possible, hands-on participation and buy-in excuse me, throughout the project life cycle. Differences are inevitable. Customer involvement during these stages makes them more palatable. Finally, tech refresh. It's basically a scheduled maintenance program for your test system. This is something as simple as a review of your system technology platform and can be as complex as a regular scheduled upgrades. So if you plan on running your test system for several years, you may want to plan your system evaluations or maintenance upgrades every 2 to 3 years. I know Jim suggested every 3 to 4, 3 to 5 years, but depending on the level of complexity and how much you're evaluating or how much you're running your system, these evaluations could be in shorter intervals. The goal here is to keep up with technological changes. Otherwise, you're likely to destined to have history repeat itself and end up with another obsolete system. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So as our last slide, I just wanted to thank everybody who's attended. Hopefully this webinar was useful to you. We tried super hard to provide some useful information to you to help make better decisions. Like I mentioned a couple times earlier, we will be sending you some resources, specifically some information around the tech refresh plan and some other things which we hope you can use. We also really like feedback, so we would very much appreciate it if you would take 3 minutes to fill out a survey which we'll be sending you. As they say, you can only improve what you measure, And Viewpoint Systems, being a test company, we certainly do like measuring. It's our business after all. So now we'll open it up for some questions. And Jim, you can read those off as need be.
Thanks, Jim and Sam. Yeah, exactly. And just to remind viewers that go ahead and feel free to use the question console on the screen in front of you, where questions are similar. I'll sort of combine them and paraphrase them to make them readable. Let me kick off with the issue for Jim and Sam about the timing for upgrading an obsolete test system. In my experience, I'm sure many of our viewers' experience, it's very common that you upgrade your test system when you have a catastrophic failure, or when your calibration lab basically gives you the bad news and said, I'm sorry, we can no longer calibrate this unit, and now your line is down and you got to take action immediately. It's easy to fall into that trap of waiting until something forces your hand. How do you predict how far in advance you need to start thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and obviously that's part of the reason why we put this webinar together, because it's a stressful situation when you get into a scenario where you have to respond instantly. Because production is down. The best way to predict something like that really is to just go through a periodic review of a tech refresh. There's no way, obviously, if you don't have an assessment of what the hardware and software state is of your existing test system, to be able to predict when that's going to fail. I mean, obviously, you might get some hints like Sam was suggesting at GE with components failing and having to do some retrofitting on the fly. But the best way to really understand when you may be having problems is to go through the life cycle of all the components in your test system. You may have to call manufacturers to find out when a particular, say, analog input card or a signal conditioning unit is going to go obsolete. But that effort involved is obviously worthwhile in terms of trying to understand when you're going to run into problems and work around those and come up with a plan. Well, Sam, if you have anything else to add there.
I would say also, I mean, usually if you're dealing with a meter in electronics, the change isn't so rapid. But as Jim mentioned early on, if you're dealing with operating systems and software code, that changes a lot more rapidly. So it's always good to look at the system you have and do a comparison against the technology that's out there. And that'll give you a good sense of your delta, your difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things we find nowadays, especially more than we used to even 10 years ago, is that the software and the electronics tend to have a shorter lifespan than they used to. People are churning newer versions. We also see customers who are starting to see how the apps that are being written on their smartphones are being churned out rapidly, and they're starting to pay attention to the fact that software is changing pretty rapidly. So the vendors of all those software and hardware tools are reacting to that and putting out new products at an ever-increasing rate. So.
Jim and Sam, another question just popped up from the floor. Question about about line applications in this case. If you're rolling in a new system, for example, and you don't have the luxury of actually shutting the line down, would you recommend some kind of a concurrency plan? Would you roll a new tester in, for example, as a line bypass while you continue losing the old equipment, or would you redundantly test to validate new equipment while the old equipment is still there? Just wondering how, basically, as a running change, is how you implement new equipment.
Okay, so that's a really good question.
That is a good question.
And there's a lot of dependencies on that. So if you're in a situation where, like we were, there's no turning back, once the old system gets ripped out, or ripped out is too strong a word, but removed, disassembled, and the new system goes in, unless you've done a comparison, so if you've got units that undergo, you want to do an as found, as left type of test, where you take some units and run a test on the old system, collect the data, Jim had mentioned this, and then run, if possible, the same units again against the new system. Now you have a real comparison. That's one way to do it. The concurrent line, I mean, if you have the space to do that, and again, depending on the size, so for our situation, some of our units were a few hundred pounds, roll on conveyors. So it's much more difficult for us to put in a parallel line and test that way. If you have the ability in your test system is completely, it's autonomous, where you're just taking something that might be a bread box, a shoe box, something smaller and lighter. If you have the ability to set up this system, say before you get out to the production area, and you can run units, that's a great way to do it. So you can make all your changes and your fixes before the systems even move to the floor. Either way, I think what you want to make sure you have is either a traceable standard that you can reference and test with the old and new system, or have a lot of UUTs that you can use as your before and after.
So I'll just add to Sam's comment there. I don't think I've ever seen anybody that did a concurrent test line. So in other words, running parts through both testers in a specifically built line. But I have seen scenarios where Sam mentioned where pieces will be pulled off an existing line and run through the new tester and put back on the line, so they've gone through both old and new tester. In fact, we're working on a project with GE right now where they're doing that same thing. So that way you need just some floor space for the new tester that sits next to the assembly line or the production line without having to modify the line itself.
Jim and Sam, it's very common for production engineers, of course, to want to put off upgrading test systems as late as possible in the product development cycle. And of course, it's always easy to make the argument that let's upgrade the test systems when we release the next version of the product under test at this point. Are you folks given enough lead time to actually design and get systems up and running?
Does that answer your question?
I'm shaking my head. No, the answer is no. Typically, you're not. There's not a lot of forward planning. Jim had mentioned this in the early on.
Yeah, and in fact, and I'm noticing the time here too. But just quickly, part of the thing that we have found in those scenarios is that simulation systems help a lot, because often the product that you're trying to develop the test for isn't quite done yet, and having a simulation system that you can basically build a tester around that acts like the part, or at least what you think it's going to act like, gets you a long way towards being ready when the new product design is ready and released for production.
Jim and Sam, when replacing older systems, and typically we tend to increase the level of automation in test systems with each iteration, with each generation. And in my experience, as we automate, of course, is that we make it more user-friendly and we de-skill the test process. But we run a risk of losing some capability or some of the user skill at the same time. Is there any way we can sort of capture that somehow, or bottle some of that experience, or the hands-on, tactile user experience of being the test expert when we build an automated system, or these things just become red light and green light, go, no go?
Wow, that's a difficult question too, because I would need to see some specifics. Certainly some of the tests that we run are so complicated that you need a person to be able to monitor some of the testing. For example, there might be some manual assembly in between test step 1 and test step 2. But for highly automated ones, we have tried to make the test systems be a little smarter and to remove some of the assessment that a person might do, even to the point where combining test steps into one mega test step so that the automation is a lot more user-friendly. It really depends on the specifics. I can't give too much more detail than that. I don't know if
sure, and gents, we're almost against our hard stop at the top of the hour. I think we have time for just for one more question, and that question basically is about the the extent to which the customer or the end user drives the testing methodology. There's a tendency for some operations, of course, to test in the way the customer wants you to test. So they're not very proactive that way. Other operations I've seen, they actually bring the customer in at the very beginning of the product development process and then put the testing methodology in basically as part of the part design. Can end users, can manufacturers get customers involved early, and can they talk to you earlier in the process to try and streamline this?
Yeah, so obviously we encourage that at all times. I think Sam kind of indicated in the obsolescence upgrade that we did that a key part of being successful there was to get, he kept calling it his customer, which was actually just another GE division, but those people on the production floor were heavily involved with that upgrade. Getting as many people involved as possible is really a key, and if you can get your end customers to help you sign off on tests, which happens often in military and aerospace, for example, that's great. Yeah, ask them.
And that's a great way to end. I see we're up against the top of the hour at our hard stop. I would like to thank Dr. Jim Campbell and Sam Sansone for just a fascinating hour. We could go on about this for just forever. I'd also like to thank Viewpoint Systems for sponsoring today's webinar, and I'd like to remind all viewers that this and all webinars are available for viewing again on www.engineering.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.